Hi, I'm Don Cantor, former co-director of JLIC at Johns Hopkins University and current director of the Richmond Jewish Learning Experience in Richmond, Virginia.
And I'm Alex Ozar, co-director of JLIC at Yale University, and this is the Torah JLIC podcast. JLIC supports thousands of young Jews in their college years and beyond, providing them with the nourishment they need to sustain an upward trajectory of Jewish commitment and growth as they enter the broader world. And the animating engine of that effort, that has always been and will always be Talmud Torah, high-level, richly meaningful, thoughtfully creative Torah learning, ambitiously attuned to the realities of where our students are. On the Torah JLIC podcast, we hope to share some of that Torah with you. Thanks for listening.
Today, we get to talk to Rav Avi Schwartz, who is the co-director at Rutgers University. Rav Avi was born in Queens and grew up in Sharon, Massachusetts, and West Orange, New Jersey. He graduated from YU, the Yeshiva College. Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary decided to give him smicha, and he also graduated from the Wurzweiler School of Social Work. He's worked for Bnei Akiva and NCSY. He learned in the Gross Kollel in Jerusalem. And Rav Avi is also a social worker, providing mental health support for youth and adolescents and their families. He loves football, NBC sitcoms, Safaria, and Israeli and Jewish pop music. He is also one of the minds behind the semi-popular Vad Habadchanim Jewish humor social media account. He runs JLIC at Rutgers with his wife, Sarah. Hello, Avi. Sarah. Starting off on a good foot.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. Thanks for coming on, Avi.
I'm so happy it's going pretty well. I am really happy to be here. And it's my absolute honor to be a part of this podcast that I listen to every single episode. And I am so excited to be a part of, finally one of these episodes too.
Amazing. What's going on campus, Avi?
Things are great. We have a huge, strong Jewish community, Orthodox community here. We had a prospective student Shabbaton. We had about 30 high school juniors and seniors come for Shabbos, run entirely by students. And we had a panel talking about the community here, talking about the different opportunities for them on campus. It's a real bracha to, have such students who are able to, run programming. And I'm just here as a facilitator, just watching and getting nachas.
Amazing. I heard there are rumors you might be going somewhere else next year?
Yeah, God willing, I'm going to be taking my talents to Israel, across the pond. This is actually my last semester at Rutgers.
Ooh.
And I'm very excited to hopefully go back into the therapy world. I quit therapy. As a therapist. I quit therapy to do this job full time. And I'm excited to go back into that world to, give support to those who need it.
And in Eretz Israel.
All the more so, yeah.
So, Avi, what should we talk about today?
It is Adar, and Adar is a time that we make light of important things. But I think we're going to take it serious and discuss mental health and Torah. And I think how mental health is categorized in halacha and ways that we are able to support our students as educators. But I obviously come from a different background than many other JLIC educators. And some of my students try to take advantage of that. They start asking me shilas, and they start as religious shilas, like hashkafic shilas, and then turn into maybe a little bit more of a halakhic shila, and then turn into a mental health shila. And then I have to be like, oh, pause. I charge extra for that.
Can you give us some examples, like obviously without identifying details?
Yeah. So this one student, his name is David. I'm kidding. That's not his name. I'm not going to give any details about anyone. So. I mean, I've gotten several. I've gotten a lot. For example, OCD comes up a lot, especially in the frum world. Imagine, someone who is trying to become frum and has undiagnosed OCD. We'll get to ADHD later, but trying to figure out if he washed Nagelwasser properly enough. And so he could be standing outside after the shul, washing his hands because did he make sure that he got each hand properly up to the wrist, up to the knuckle? Did he do enough? And not realizing that, he definitely did it perfectly fine. But because his mind is playing tricks on him, it's telling him, no, if you don't do this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't going to love you. You can't daven. It's going to be, a complete disaster if you don't get this exact halacha correctly. And so you have to figure out, at what point is it not a religious shaila anymore? At what point is it not a halachic shaila and it becomes a mental health shaila? For example, the halacha of having kavanah during Shemona Esrei. You have to have the kavanah at least for the first bracha. And if you don't, the halacha is you have to keep going and not go back, because who's to say that you're ever going to have the right kavanah for that first bracha of Shemona Esrei? None of us do. I mean, I especially don't, or at least I try to. But imagine if someone with OCD was going to make sure that he has the proper kavanah for every single Shemona Esrei, he's going to keep going back to that first bracha because it was never good enough.
Tell us how you handle it, or how you think about it, or how you've been thinking about it.
Very often you have to go to the source and see if it manifests in other kind of ways besides for in a religious setting. And often it does. Often it comes up in classes. Often it comes up in family life. And then it's important to get them the right kind of help. It's important to get them the right kind of support. And even though I am a licensed, social worker and a mental health, specialist, it's very important to set those boundaries with the students. And the students, I've had several students ask me, "Oh, can you also be my therapist because you know me so well as my rabbi?" And I'm like, you just explained the problem right there. Because I know you as your rabbi, I can't also be your therapist. We have very different goals. And it's very important to, like a rabbi tries to do one thing and a mental health consultant specialist has a very different goal. And trying to have that dual relationship is just not going to work.
Can you spell that out? I'm curious. I mean, it makes intuitive sense, but like, what are the different goals between being a rabbi and being a therapist, and how do they conflict?
So it's very funny you ask. There is a lot of overlap, which is why I think, thankfully, I've been very lucky to be in this job, that I had my mental health background before this and my social work background, because there definitely is a lot of overlap. But when it comes to some of the specific issues, the end goal and the way to get there are very different. Like, for example, you have some kind of cases where students ask you a question and you have to figure out how to treat it. And a rabbi might say it's a halakhic issue, but mentally and emotionally, it might be the right call. And so if I was a therapist, I would give one piece of advice. If I was a rabbi, I'd give a different piece of advice. And it's hard when those kind of ideals come into conflict. That being said, though, yeah, Don, you go ahead. It's your turn.
Do you think that there actually is a conflict? I mean, so if can something actually be right in one aspect, like objectively right from a therapeutic perspective, but not right from a halakhic perspective?
Great question. And I think that there are steps, and I don't think it's an all or nothing kind of approach. Like, for example, if someone is trying to become frum for the first time, you don't give them everything to take on immediately. You have to, there's a process of like how to start taking on, kashrus and Shabbos. Ideally they would be going straight in and, doing all halacha, all 613 immediately. But practically speaking, emotionally speaking, it's not. And so when, imagine, for example, if a student is telling you about he had some not great boundaries with his previous girlfriend, who was encouraging him and coercing him to go farther physically than he was intending on, because he's Orthodox and she is not. And now he has a different girlfriend where they're still being physical, but he's able to set those boundaries. As a rabbi, I would tell him, in theory, to it's very important to stop doing anything physical in theory. But as a mental health, specialist, I'd be like, very good on you for being able to set those boundaries in your physical life. And I think, it's hard because there is still a value as a rabbi saying, good that you're able to, set those boundaries, but try to do more to not have any kind of physical contact until marriage, obviously. But at the same time, you also want to encourage his, emotional and mental growth without, giving a hechsher on what he's doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it leads to, in my head, it's such an interesting balance where I feel like precisely as a rabbi, if you are appropriately psychologically, emotionally, spiritually attuned to the human being, as you should be, so you are going to be treating these things with sensitivity, and there's going to be some, real patience and care for the psychological aspects of these questions. You're not just going to say "usser," that's it.
Right.
There's going to be a real conversation, but also then I think what you're conveying, which is really powerful, is that. But also, there's a separate role for a therapist. They also need that. Like, there are lines. For you, it's always going to be complicated, and you're going to be needing to hold the halakhic line on some level, or at least communicate that. And then that leaves you. It sounds like that leaves you handicapped,
correct,
in a way that a therapist isn't.
Correct. So I think on the one hand, I'm able to provide that, mental health first aid in some sense, especially if like someone's really going through a crisis and I'm not able to refer them to someone yet, which ends up being a big part of my, job, thankfully I'm still in these mental health counselors WhatsApp groups. I'm able to still get referrals for my students. And because I have this network, I'm still able to help them out. But it is important for me to be able to, triage, figure out what's important, what I can deal with right now before I get a referral for them, and do what's best for them right now before, being able to pass them on to someone that can give them the appropriate help and has the qualifications and the role to help them.
And I would imagine when you did and when you will, God willing, soon again see people in your therapist hat, I assume based on proper professional standards, like you would never say, okay, but also I just need to tell you that halakhically this is problematic.
Correct. 100%. Correct. And I, even as a therapist, I was dealing with a lot of frum Jews, and I had to, and one of the reasons it was very hard for me to go, when I first started this job, I was part-time a therapist and part-time as a rabbi. And it was very hard for me to go back and forth because I had to keep switching those hats and working with frum Jews as a therapist and working with frum Jews on campus. It was very hard for me to, keep switching about thinking about what kind of what kind of advice I should give them. And I have to remind myself who I'm working with. And some of my, clients would ask me for religious advice. And some of my, constituents at Rutgers would ask me for, mental health advice. Often I'm able to help them, but I have to remember, what my role is and if the advice I'm giving them is congruent with the treatment that they are supposed to be getting.
I remember, honestly, it's one of the very few things I remember from the professional training part of rabbinical school. It's just that I kept saying over and over again, you are not a licensed therapist, unless you happen to be a licensed therapist.
Right.
But as a rabbi, you are not a licensed therapist. Please refer to professionals.
Right.
We can have that first conversation, but
I'll tell you, it's very interesting that there are a lot of similarities that have been helpful for me as a therapist in this role, especially when it comes to giving advice with dating and couples. And I find that I often use a mashal, like a parable, and compare a relationship with a spouse or significant other and a relationship with Hashem. That in order, so I have many students that ask me, Rebbe, am I ready to start dating? The same way that, many of us asked our rabbis or didn't in college or in yeshiva, are we ready to start dating? And so I get this question a lot. And sometimes they are ready. And I say, you know what? Yeah, I think you're ready to start, getting your feet wet in the dating pool. And sometimes I give them straight up and I say, listen, I don't think your self-esteem is there yet. And I think you need to work on yourself before you're able to, love somebody else. If you don't love yourself, how are you going to love somebody else? And I think often, many times, people, when they go to yeshiva, they don't have such a high self-esteem yet. And they attach to the thing that makes them feel good, which is being successful in the Beis Medrash, being successful in davening, being successful in their avodas Hashem. But the moment that it hits them that they still don't have such a good self-esteem, it all comes crumbling down. And I know many such cases, and especially on the college campuses. I mean, at Rutgers we have a huge frum community, so many of the freshmen are still trying to figure out who they're going to be as people, and they start dating someone the moment they walk into the dorms. They don't know who they are yet. So their whole mahut, their whole self-worth is based on the relationship that they're starting on their first day of college. And the moment that, if God forbid they break up, they are having an identity crisis. They're trying to figure out who they are because they never actually had the time to figure out who they were before they started dating. And so sometimes it happens organically, and sometimes couples are able to figure it out and be able to create their own identity before sharing it with somebody else. But often people start dating and then that becomes their identity. And, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But often when I'm giving advice to those who are trying to become frummer and those who are trying to, start dating, is to make sure that you know who you are first as a person, as a Jew, before you are able to create a bigger life with a spouse, with a significant other. And before you try to take on more things in your Yiddishkeit, make sure that, you're doing it lishma, make sure that you are doing it knowing your full identity before, trying to create something bigger.
Yeah, well, they're lucky to have you around. You mentioned in the beginning developing Torah of psychology and their psychotherapy. Have there been things you've been thinking about or things you've been learning, things you've been developing?
A bit. There is, I've seen some great books from Rabbi Dr. Sal Hamoff. He has, I forget what the book is called, but he has a lot of Torah ideas through psychology. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Rabbi Dr. Sal Hamoff.
No,
He lives in Long Beach. He is a practicing psychologist, and he's come out with a sefer. I'm going to Google it while I'm here.
Sure.
The name of his book that he came out with that I have. It's a fantastic book that basically discusses different therapeutic models in psychology and sources for that in Chazal and in the Torah. And I find that to be very helpful, because a lot of what we find, it's called the Handbook of Torah and Mental Health by Dr. Sal Hamoff and Dr. David Rosmarin, who you might have heard of. I think he teaches at Harvard. Also, he's a gaon when it comes to mental health. Both
But he couldn't get a job at a decent school?
Apparently not.
Whatever. I get it. It's hard. It's a hard
Yeah. I guess the Bulldog Crimson
look
goes deep. But yeah, so I think that there is a lot of great work to be done with the frum community, and showing the frum community that this is not just some new ideas that have been thought up in the past couple hundred years. Rather, these ideas have been shared from the Torah and Chazal for millennia already. It starts to decrease the stigma of mental health in the frum community. I think it's very, very helpful. I can give one example. When discussing the Meraglim, I know Parsha Shlach is coming up in like 4 months or so, 3 months or so, that the Meraglim come back and they're telling Moshe, they're telling Aaron that we saw the Nephilim and we were like grasshoppers in their eyes. Did the giants tell them that they look at grasshoppers, or were they projecting their own insecurities onto themselves basically, and saying, or I guess projecting onto the Nephilim and saying, oh, they probably assume that we look like grasshoppers, and that's what they're telling everybody else. We are terrified of them because they think of us as inferior, or they just had such low self-esteem they didn't have enough amunah in Hashem. And that's why the entire society of, Am Yisrael and the Midbar kind of came crumbling down, because their entire purpose of going to the Midbar was to go to Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan at the time. And because of the Meraglim's low self-esteem, projecting their insecurities onto the Nephilim, then they had to wait another 40 years to go into the Midbar, 38 years, whatever. And I think there's a lot of things to be learned by saying you have to take an objective step back and say, do they actually think that I'm inferior, or are they scared of us? Are they scared because they know we have Hashem on our side, that they don't have Hashem on their side? And I think, that's when Kalev comes in and says, no, we can go up. Hashem is going to help us every step of the way. So even though it's scary, you can validate being scared, but understanding that where it's coming from and recognizing that you don't need to project your fear onto something that doesn't necessarily warrant it. One of the greatest things I heard in grad school, and I apply this to myself all the time, whether as a rabbi or as a therapist, and I even tell it to a lot of my students and clients, that any insecurity that you are aware of is an asset. Any insecurity that you're unaware of is a liability. Imagine as a therapist, you're working with a client who has issues with their parents, and their parents are controlling. Their parents are trying to determine who they marry, where they go to school, what their major is. And I have my own daddy issues, imagine. And I could say that, cut off your parents. Your parents are the worst, and you don't need them in your life. Not realizing that it's my own insecurity that is posketing therapeutically what they should be doing. And so, if I was aware of my own daddy issues, mommy issues, then I'd be able to take a step back and say, oh, okay, I have my own issues. I'm able to compartmentalize that. And now for you have your own journey. Let's figure out what your own journey is. So that's why I find that, when it comes to even our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if we have our own issues, that we're trying to work out in our Avodas Hashem, and we're not aware of our insecurities in our Avodas Hashem, then we are going to sometimes say the wrong thing based on our own subjective thoughts versus what our client or what our congregant needs to hear.
So in what way can a recognized insecurity be an asset?
Because you're able to take a step back and say, this is who I am. This is, I'm able to acknowledge the fact that I have my own issues, and yet I'm able to first overcome them. Because in the end of the day, any kind of sickness in general, it's a lot easier to deal with once you're aware of it. If, God forbid, someone has cancer, then but they don't know why they're throwing up. They don't know why they feel sick. That's very scary. Once you're able to diagnose what the issue is, then you're able to attack it one step at a time. So if you have your own insecurity, you can say like, okay, listen, I know I have an insecurity. I know that I haven't dealt with this yet, but once I'm aware of it, I'm able to separate that from my other work that I need to be doing with my congregants or with my clients.
It seems like the people that you're drawing from are contemporary writers and thinkers. Is there anyone who addresses it is there any Torah that's addressed this and like in the Masorah that's before the last 100 years?
I don't know. Maybe. I'm sure. I wish I wish I was good at writing down notes when I've like heard all these things in smicha and in grad school. I'm sure. I don't think I'm saying any kind of chidushin. I really don't think so. But I think from all my rebbeim, I think I think there is actually someone that's been able to give me a very good derech in this, not necessarily like the same way that and the way I said it now, but a very good derech that I've used to like every single person has their own journey and every single person needs to hear what they need to hear, not necessarily an objective psak in therapy or in, halacha. Like, for example, Rav Baruch Simon. Rav Baruch Simon is my Rebbe from Yeshiva University. And the thing that makes me very proud to be a Talmud of Rav Simon is that he is someone that sees, that first of all, he knows Kol Torah Kula in terms of halacha, and he's able to see, okay, so you need to hear this psak right now. Someone else needs to hear this psak right now. For example, when I was in Smicha, I was engaged and I was doing chassan classes with Rav Simon. At the same time, we were doing Hilchos Nida and Shir at the same time. And so hearing the way that he would paskin in Shir and hearing the wide spectrum of kulas and chumras and then saying like, okay, Avi, for you, this is how you're going to paskin. But when you're going to be paskening for a Baal Tshuva, when you're going to be paskening for a more yeshiva guy, then you have to know what they need to hear based on, who they are. And I think having that kind of mentality has been very helpful for me as a rabbi and a therapist, that every single person needs to hear, something that is appropriate and shaykh for them, as opposed to saying, well, listen, this is what the Shulchan Aruch says straight down, and we're going to retrace out of a book, when really there are the Nosei Kelim and other kulas here and there. You wouldn't necessarily give every single kula to every single person. You wouldn't give every single chumrah to every single person. But, Chanuch Lanar al Pidarko, that, there are different ways to, share the halacha for what people need to digest it.
So what does that tell you, or what perspective does that give you about halacha? And you were talking in the beginning about people with OCD and issues that they have, and it seems to and it seems like this focus that we have on doing things to the finest detail is one thing that you could see on the surface perceive as being the proper way to observe halacha. But it seems like what you're saying is that it's not just that.
Correct. So I would say that, there are different ways that we paskin. There are Ashkenazi, like halachos. There are Sephardi halachos, the way we paskin the different hacharos that we have based on our communities. And so halacha is halacha. Halacha is binding. That is the one constant that's been keeping Am Yisrael together for the past 3,000 years. That being said, within halacha, within a Masorah of, from the Tanaim to the Amoraim down the line, we are able to have a Masorah of halacha that people can accept based on their community and what they need to hear. There are reasons why kulas exist. There are reasons why chumras exist. And I think that for an individual person, it's very important to have someone that knows you, that's able to give you the psak that you need. Because, for example, if I was to go to the Gadol Hador, imagine if I was to go to Rav Moshe Sternbach. Rav Moshe Sternbach is the head of the Eidah Haredis, I'm pretty sure, in Israel. And if I was asking a shayla for myself, he could paskin, not knowing me, but he could paskin based on what the Shulchan Aruch and Nosei Kelim say. But, if I was to talk to you, let's say, like, Rav Aryeh Leibowitz, who knows me a lot better, Rav Aryeh Leibowitz also knows halacha. I'm not comparing Rav Aryeh Leibowitz to Rav Sternbach. They're both obviously gedolim in their own right. But Rav Leibowitz knows me and is able to say, okay, for you, you should do this and this and this because of who you are and what you need. So even though halacha is binding for everybody, having someone that knows you and knows your metzias and knows where you're coming from is a lot better to be able to have a Masorah for halacha.
It seems to be like on the same continuum as what we were talking about earlier when with the difference between what mental health might say versus what halacha says, and that to a certain extent, halacha is not or shouldn't be practiced as something which is completely rigid, to the extent that it will that instead of stimulating your growth, it will stunt it.
Good. So now I think that is where, pulling it for full circle, that if someone is dealing with a mental health issue and has been relying on a chumrah, then you could have someone that knows you and says, okay, you know what? You don't need to rely on this chumrah. Don't, focus on this chumrah. Focus on this kula, because you're not breaking halacha, and yet you're able to take care of yourself as well by not driving yourself crazy with certain chumras. Like, for example, going back to Rav Simon's shir, I was zocheh to learn, the entire spectrum of halacha through Rav Simon's, and I was speaking to a friend of mine who was a Baal Shula, and was learning from a certain Rav who said that this and this and this and then this, it was all straight halacha, no room for kulas or chumras. And I was showing him inside the different achronim, saying like, oh, actually, there are plenty of kulas here and there, and if someone thinks that doing anything different than what the psak was, is completely going off the derech, they might just drop everything, and they might not even know that there are still plenty of communities that say that there's a very relied upon kula for a certain kind of case. And I think it's very important to at least for people to know the spectrum of halacha, so that they're able to, in shachat chak or even not shachat chak, be able to take care of themselves when it comes to their mental health, that they can rely on other opinions while still keeping halacha.
I think what's so powerful about this for me, and the picture you're painting, is that we started at the beginning talking about acute psychological distress or disorder and how you'd relate to that, both as a therapist and as a rabbi, and how those overlap and sometimes maybe are in tension. But what you're bringing out is that there's a universal psychological layer to ideal halakhic practice, right? You can regress to thinking about halakha in purely rigid terms and think that for most people, or in the standard case, it really is just the letter of the law and that's that. And then for the subset of cases, there are people with special psychological distress that require attention. And no, actually, we're all on a psychotherapeutic journey of some kind. And all of us in our aspirations towards Avodas Hashem are going to require attention and care and thoughtfulness and sensitivity to ourselves as psychotherapeutic beings with all kinds of complicated stuff going on in our neshamas. And we're not going to be successful at doing the halacha if we're not paying attention to those. And as rabbis, we're not going to be successful with anybody if we're not paying attention to what's really going on and listening. And I was saying, like, this is just riffing, but we're talking about precedents for psychotherapy and earlier layers of Torah. God creates the world, and there's like a fairly strict justice regime going on. People sin, they get punished. And then all of a sudden, like, Hashem realizes that Yetzer Leva Adam Rami Nurav, and like, really, maybe we got to take it a little bit slower, think like a little more long term about how we're going to bring these people along, and like, there's going to be a little bit of effort here, appoint one person there, and see how that goes. But there's like this understanding that human beings are really, really complicated and kind of messed up, and maybe that's God's fault, and kind of take responsibility for that. And so if Hashem wants us to do what Hashem wants, it's going to come with some love and care and sensitivity to us as the finite, really kind of chaotic, silly human beings we are.
Right.
Tell us a little more. Last question here. You talked about the stigma of psychotherapy in Orthodox communities. I'm curious, like, how you've dealt with that. You talked a little bit about framing things in terms of Torah, but how you've dealt with that in your work so far. And then I know if you're going to Israel and hoping to do this work, these fault lines. On the one hand, things can be a little bit more fluid and dynamic in Israel. There's just so much more going on, and people are used to new things. But also in many communities in Israel, the lines are so much more rigid, and alarm bells go off much quicker.
Right. So I have a few things to say about this. I'll start from the stigma perspective and see how I apply that here, and then just talk about what's next in Israel. So it's fascinating. I always tell students, you should always have a therapist. If you don't need it, even better, but have someone that is objective, that is not your parent, that's not your best friend from yeshiva just to talk to. Because having someone that's objective, that just doesn't know you from birth, but is able to talk to you Basher Husham, or Basher Hi Shama, that's able to talk to you about what you need to hear right now. Having someone to talk it out with is so crucial. And then if you go through something that's more acute, then you already have someone that knows you a little bit to talk you through what you're dealing with. And so I say, like, every therapist has their own therapist, and if they don't, they either desperately need one or they're lying. And it's very important because imagine, all the more so rabbis as well, dealing with so much baggage from their clients and dealing with the baggage from like their constituents and congregants. There's a lot to unpack, and having someone to unpack it with is so crucial. I mean, thankfully, the OU JLIC has Dr. Caroline Pizer for the directors, because we deal with a lot of stuff on a regular basis. So having someone like Dr. Pizer to talk it out with has been a godsend. And I'm thrilled that, JLIC recognized this need and has brought Caroline to us. So now the question is, what's next in Israel? I have two ideas of what I want to do next. Who knows if any of these are going to, happen? I was talking to one of my rebbeim, Mordechai Berkman of Aseret, a couple nights ago, and he says, everyone goes to Israel with a plan of what they want to do. 9 out of 10 times, something else comes up and it's just as good, if not better. So here is what I'm thinking, and we'll see how it actually happens, practically speaking. I spoke to a lot of JLIC Israel directors, and I asked them about how their students get mental health support. And they said it's not so budget. It's not so easy because their campuses have their own counseling centers, but it's hard to get an appointment because there are thousands of students on campus that want to get an appointment. If they do get an appointment, who knows if they speak English? And if they speak English, who knows if they're culturally competent and with it for an American kid or a British kid or an Australian kid or any Anglo kid that, has major adjustment issues moving to a new country across the world. So my thought and my hope is I want to give some kind of support to American, British, Australian, English-speaking students on Israeli college campuses. We know that, especially since October 7th, there are going to be plenty more students who are going to be staying in Israel for college. They have an Am Yisrael mindset, and they want to be there for Am Yisrael in the good and the bad. And I want to be there for them as well. And I want to create a team of people who are going to be dealing with mental health issues for those students who need the support. Even if they're not going through anything acute, the adjustment disorder itself is going to be huge, just moving across the world. And that's number one. Number two is something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. I've been giving chassan classes to some of my students. And when they're having issues, I'm able to give them the halacha and the hashkafa and the emotional aspects of, trying to guide them through it. But when it comes to the physical aspects, I'm not trained. I'm not trained in any of that kind of thing. Thankfully, there is a guy named Rabbi Dr. David Rivner. He is the premier sex therapist in Israel for the Haredi and Hasidic communities, and he started the sex therapy program at Bar Ilan. And I spoke to him last year about potentially doing his program that he started at Bar Ilan. That right now I'm a social worker, but I can also get certified as a sex therapist, so that when I'm giving chassan classes to students, I can also help them with the other aspects that I have not yet been able to give them support with. And he told me, listen, everyone wants to work with young couples, but especially since the war started, a lot of veterans are coming home from war physically and mentally scarred. And they have to learn how to, live at home again and be with their wives again from scratch. And he says that there's going to be a lot of work that's going to be needed to be done with veterans coming home from war. So these are the two things I'm strongly considering for next year. Maybe both, maybe neither, maybe one or the other. But I think it's time for me to take my talents from Rutgers to have a different Am Yisrael mindset in Eretz Yisrael.
Oh, it sounds like we may well need to do a follow-up podcast next year.
Potentially. We'll see if the time difference is going to work out for me.
Yeah.
Where is he now?
I'm in New Brunswick at Rutgers. Don, we covered this already.
Well, thank you so much. Really a wealth of insight, and just amazing to get a little window into the extraordinary work you're doing and you're going to be doing.
Thank you so much, and I'm excited to listen to this episode in addition to all the other ones that I have listened to several times.
We appreciate it. We appreciate your support, man.
All right, Rabbi Ozar, Rabbi Cantor, good to see you guys.
You too.
Thanks so much for coming on.
You got it.